This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We're still talking Thunder Junction Limited. It's still a pretty new format, and it's a lot of fun. If you haven't tried it yet, I definitely recommend you do. Especially because if you didn't like the last couple sets and have sort of pieced out from Limited, you're definitely missing out on a set that has a lot more interesting play to it than what we've seen lately. Anyway, in this particular video, I'm going to talk about 10 cards that you should stop playing in this Limited format. More accurately, these are cards that are being taken way too highly given what their actual win rates are. As usual, for this type of video, I use 17 Lands data. You can go to 17lands.com, sign up to have your Magic Arena data tracked, and you can find out things like win rates, average pick, things like that, allowing analysis like this to be supplemented by data. So this is a list of cards where I've seen people playing them way too much, and the data also seems to back up the fact that people either shouldn't be playing them or should at least be playing them a heck of a lot less. As usual, I like to have a little baseline card to look at that sort of helps us understand where we're going. And that card is Nezumi Link Breaker. So this is not a card I'm saying you shouldn't play, but it's a card with a 54.8% win rate, and the average win rate in this format for 17 Lands users is 54.4. So, you know, this is just like right down the middle, more or less, and it's being taken around a 10th pick. So why did I choose this card? Well, because every single card on this list has a significantly lower win rate, but is being taken significantly higher. So, you know, this serves as a good baseline because I think we can all look at this card and be like, yeah, it's nice that it's a 1-mana 1/1 that leaves behind a body. You know, it's a solid card, but it's not amazing or anything. And yet, cards that are worse than it are being taken a lot higher. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's start with Shackle Slinger. So this has an 8.68 as its average pick, and it has a 49.3% win rate. That is horrendous. That more or less means unplayable. You know, this is a card I did think was going to be better. You know, the double spell trigger is pretty cool because, you know, tapping things is good. And it's nice that even if your opponent already has a tap thing, you get to lock it down for a turn. But as far as double spell payoffs go, it just hasn't really been that great. It's also kind of annoying that unlike something like the Loan Shark, if you play this as your second spell, you don't get anything, right? And that happens sometimes because you draw cards with other spells, and then you draw into this, and then, you know, you don't get the trigger, and that certainly matters. But we also have a creature that has pretty below rate stats. I mean, they gave green a bunch of beefy creatures in this format, and a lot of what makes creatures good or bad in this format is how well they line up against 4-mana 5/4 Trampler, things like that. And Shackle Slinger just does not line up well. It dies to 1-mana removal, and then like the payoff of occasionally tapping something or stunning it is just not enough for this card to be something that really is worth trying to use. And yeah, the fact that there's a common payoff that is both easier to make work, like with double spells in the form of Loan Shark, and just like better in every way. It also has a pretty good stat line for lining up against big beefy creatures, unlike Shackle Slinger since it's a 3/4. So yeah, I mean, Loan Shark is basically what you always want in this slot, where Shackle Slinger could be, but it's just not anywhere near good enough. It doesn't give you a card worth of value for jumping through the hoop it asks you for, or even really get close. Most of this list is commons and uncommons, but there is one rare I want to talk about. Maybe even, I think it's a mythic rare. And that is Jace Reawakened. So people are taking this around pick 2, 1.96 actually, so even earlier than that. And the win rate is 50.9%. So yeah, this is just not a good card in Limited. I wasn't super high on it in the set review. It has ended up being even worse than I expected. I thought having kind of a value planeswalker that can come down in the mid game would be fine, but it just doesn't do enough. You know, he doesn't protect himself. None of the effects that he gives you are remotely powerful. Like, you know, the loot effect is perfectly okay. You know, if you can loot with him every turn, that's fine, but you're really not breaking the game even when you are doing that. And the fact that he can't protect himself or impact the board in any way, shape, or form has ended up pretty much making Jace Reawakened into a liability. Rares and mythics always get taken higher than they would otherwise. Some of this I think is psychological. We see cool cards and we want to take them more often. Part of this is also has to do with how gems work on Magic Arena, where, if you're somebody who drafts a ton, and a lot of 17 lands users are, once you have a full play set of a rare or mythic, you start getting gems instead of, the card, because you've already got the card. And at some point, you got to do some math, but at some point, it makes sense to take cards that give you gems. However, that's not going to have this big of an impact on when Jace Reawakened is being taken, where he's being taken as if he's like one of the biggest bombs in the format, when in reality, he's not even a card that should make the cut. Next, let's look at Ferociification. So this is maybe the least offensive, I guess, of these, in that it's being taken around pick 9.42, so it's not being taken highly, but it has a win rate of 49.6%. This is one where I've just seen people playing it a lot, and every time my opponent plays Ferociification, I sort of get excited, because it usually means they just played a card that isn't going to do enough to be worth a card and or the mana. And so, when I dove into the data, I found, people are taking it higher than they should and playing it way more often than they should. This kind of card is relatively easy to tell. It's just not going to be good in limited these days. Like, even though this format is grindy and you can mess around a little bit, especially with like graveyard stuff, a card that doesn't do anything on its own and doesn't deliver a card of value in one way, shape, or form just isn't worth it most of the time. Yes, giving keywords to things, all of that, it makes your creature into a better attacker each turn. But what do you do if you're not the beatdown, right? What does this do when you're behind? Nothing, right? And if you're ahead, it can help you sort of close out a game, but a 3-mana 3/3, which is actually useful when you're behind, spending 3 mana on anything that adds to the board is going to be just as good when you're ahead and much better when you're behind. And that's just like the problem this style of card virtually always has. Sometimes we see cards, enchantments like this, that do nothing but buff a creature and they can like kind of work out, but usually they're giving you like they cantrip, or they transform into a creature eventually. You just need these sorts of buffs to do something other than what they're doing, and this one just doesn't. I didn't think it was a good card in the set review, and it's not a good card in the format. People are playing it way too much. Your win rate is almost assuredly going down every time you do. Let's look at a similar card, has similar problems, and that is at Knife Point. People are taking this one around pick 6.5, and it's got a win rate of 50.5%. So, yeah, this is a signpost in common. I don't really fault people for, especially early in a format, being like, well, it's probably going to be good, because that's true of most signposts, right? These days, they usually push them, and if you go into a format taking them highly, you're going to be right more than you're going to be wrong. But at Knife Point is not very good, and it has the same problem Ferociification does, except it's a little better. And that problem is that it can enhance your creatures, but it doesn't really do anything when you're behind. So it gives you first strike on your turn, which can give you good attacks, and combining that with the mercenaries can be fun, because augmenting the power of a first strike creature is good and all. And the fact that this can generate mercenaries is nice, and that's what keeps it from being like completely horrendous, because it can add to the board. It just needs you to do a thing to make it happen. And that makes it certainly better than Ferociification is, but it's not pick 6.5 material. The black-red deck in general, committing crimes is easy enough in the format, and sometimes you can chain together a bunch of cool triggers like this. But on the whole, like when you look at win rates, when you play with the deck, when you play against the deck, it just doesn't feel like the cards that are paying you off for committing crimes in black-red, like a lot of them just aren't good enough. And I think that's kind of what this stands in for here, as the black-red signpost uncommon, and it not really doing what it's supposed to do. It really shows you that committing those crimes and getting, like the 2-mana 1/2 that drains a life, like, it's perfectly fine, because guess what? It does something on its own. But that kind of payoff isn't really the kind of thing that's insane or anything like that. And at Knife Point, doesn't really move the needle either. And on a similar note, we've got Eye Duelist, which is taken around pick 8 and has a 51.1% win rate. Going into the format, having a 1-mana repeatable way to commit crimes seem pretty good, because there are lots of cards that say when you commit a crime, a thing happens. Like at Knife Point. And there are times where you can set up Eye Duelist to do some pretty serious work. And I actually don't think it's the ability. I mean, the ability is maybe underperforming a little bit, the activated ability, but I think this stat line is what's holding back Eye Duelist even more. This format has several, at common and uncommon, 2-mana, 3-power creatures that at best it can trade with, and some of them are 3/2s. So Eye Duelist is in like a horrible spot to try to block in the early game, which is kind of what you need your 2-mana 1/3 with an activated ability to do. So, if they had made this, if this were a 2-mana 2/2, it would probably have at least like 1% higher of a win rate, just because it could trade with those 3/2s in the early game, and other X2s. Like, that's just having more power and a little bit less toughness is generally better in this format than having low power and high toughness, like because of things like 2/3s. Like the 2-mana 3/3 creature, the one that can only attack if you have something that has power 4 or greater, it performs really well in defensive decks, and that's because it can trade with everything else that costs the same it does, whereas Eye Duelist is sort of looking blankly at a lot of things. I mean, it can't even block the 2/2s well, right? I mean, yeah, you can keep them from getting in, but they're still turning sideways, and who knows what that means. So, this stat line of 1-mana 1/3 reach just doesn't hold up very well in this format. And yeah, the whole commit as many crimes as you can style deck has underperformed a little bit, but I think the stat line is the bigger problem here. Next, let's look at Mck Desperado. This one shocks me a little bit. People are taking it around pick 7. Okay, so pretty high. Win rate of 52%. That part doesn't shock me. This, I think, is a build around. I don't think this is a card you should straight up never play. If you end up in a deck that has Archive Trap and the Snapcaster Mage in this format that lets you cast something from your graveyard, you should probably play Mck Desperado. It is a perfectly reasonable thing to have. It's another card that pays you off for committing crimes, which, again, is a thing in the format, but it doesn't always work out. But yeah, I mean, it's mostly a vanilla 3-mana 2/4 in like 99% of decks. And while that stat line's like okay, it's just not enough to be worth a slot in your deck most of the time, unless you end up in a deck that can actually mill the opponent out to win, which is a thing sometimes in the format, but you do need, to combine a rare with an uncommon usually to make it happen. Mck Desperado on its own can't really do it. So yeah, I mean, I think people are taking it highly. I mean, it looked like it had potential because committing crimes seems fairly trivial, and it can be, but because most of these things only trigger once a turn, you're only triggering them like once every 3 turns or something, and that's just not enough to make up for 3-mana 2/4, which again is fine. So yeah, I mean, it just doesn't really do enough in most decks. So you shouldn't be taking it that highly. You're going to get them if you want them, or you should be. People are taking them too highly. So I guess maybe you can't even if you want them. But if you have Archive Trap, the whole Archive Trap combo with the 3-mana 2/3 that lets you cast a spell from your graveyard, like that whole situation means you should play Desperado. But if you don't have it, you shouldn't play it. It just isn't impactful enough. Next, let's look at Freestrider Commando, which of all the cards on the list has the highest win rate of 53.6%, but it's picked around 7.3. So, depending on the color, this might not be that bad of a win rate, but green is actually the best color in the format, in terms of win rate, as far as we know from the data so far, and that's how it feels too. Like, if green's open, you end up with absurd decks in this format, generally speaking. And so, Freestrider Commando is surprisingly underwhelming for a green card at only 53.6%, because the overall win rate is significantly higher than that. So what's the problem here? I mean, it's not a bad card, but you just have so many better options in green for this sort of slot. Like, the 4-mana 5/4 Trampler that gains you 3, it's only 4 mana if you plot it, right? But that's what Free Strider Commando is too. You pay 4 and you plot it and you get a 5/5. So it's a bigger creature, but the ETB makes a big difference. The trample makes a big difference. Like that common is just so much better than this one, even if the Commando can come down as a 3 mana 3/3 when it needs to. So, you know, there's just a lot of better green commons that sort of fill this sort of slot. You know, Cac Tarantula is also usually, you know, in the same sort of slot because it's usually a 5 mana creature. And the Commando is just, you know, not that impressive up against those cards because those cards give you value usually no matter what, whereas the Commando doesn't. It's just a big vanilla creature. So, you know, it's really not performing that well in the format. It should be sort of the green creature you run when you don't have the good ones in your deck, as opposed to one that you're slotting into your deck with regularity, and you probably shouldn't be taking it around a 7th pick. All right, let's look now at Aret's Lullaby. So this is being taken around pick 8.5 and has a win rate of 52.9%. So this is a removal spell, and you know, I thought this was going to be a little better than it has been. I thought it was going to be solid C-level removal, and it's more like C-, maybe even D+ level removal. The reason I thought it was going to be okay is, well, most of the time, this card just isn't that good, because it means your opponent did something with their creature before you killed it, which generally means you're not getting the full value that you want when you cast a removal spell, because it either means they used an ability or they attacked you with it. So either you had to block, or you took some damage, and then you're firing this off to kill it. I thought the gain 2 life being attached to Aret's Lullaby would make it okay, because it would sort of take back some of that value. But man, you know, not having a way to, like, the fact that this can only impact things that are tapped is a problem, as it usually is. I mean, it can never be premium removal, because you want cards. Premium removal usually has to be able to get a blocker out of the way as well as an attacker out of the way. Like, those are the things you want. And this kind of doesn't do either, you know. It gets the attacker out of the way, but only after it did its thing. And so gaining 2 life, sure, that makes it better than if it didn't have that line of text, certainly. But it doesn't make enough of a difference, especially, I mean, again, a lot of the creatures in the format have death triggers into the battlefield abilities. There's recursion in the format, and Aret's Lullaby doesn't stop any of that stuff from also giving a card value, even if it manages to kill it. So you almost always end up behind. Like, you know, you can say you're trading 1 for 1, and you sort of are, except that they got something out of their card, and you didn't really, other than removing their creature. So they're usually getting more than a card worth of value, and you're not. And so you just end up being behind your opponent. You know, I'm not saying you can't play this if you're in a really grindy deck, which are a thing in this format. Running one of these because you don't have better removal is okay, but you're definitely hoping you're not using Aret's Lullaby. All right, let's look now at Rakish Crew. This is taken around pick 7 and has a win rate of 51%. So unlike the other couple of enchantments on this list that don't do anything on their own, this kind of does. I mean, it does. It gives you a body. So you pay 3 for a 1/1. The problem it has is that the ability it has beyond that just isn't that impressive. I mean, first of all, 3 mana for a 1/1 that drains 1 life when it dies is a horrible rate to begin with. But then you need creatures with the right typing or for it to do stuff, which counts the token. It makes another token, sure. And while, yeah, there are outlaws all over the set, this card's effect is just still too restrictive. You know, it's already asking so much of you. First, you're like, okay, I'm playing a card that on its own is really inefficient. But then, not only do I need to pack my deck full of creatures with the right type, I have to have them die one way or another to get value out of them. And guess what? Having those creatures die often is worse than draining 1 life from the opponent. Now, you know, the black-white deck can do some sacrifice stuff and kind of go off with this a little bit, but it still needs things to line up correctly. You know, you kind of need the signpost uncommon, you know, creature to really go off with this kind of thing. It's just very hard to line up Rakish Crew so that you get a card of value out of it, much less 3 mana worth of value. I don't know how much life you need to... Probably you need to drain at least 3 life to feel okay. And that's asking a lot to begin with, and even then, you're not really getting there on what you've invested and the amount of work you put in. It just doesn't give you enough back. I mean, This one doesn't surprise me a ton. I wasn't super high on it going into the set. I think I gave it a C-, and I guess it's more like a D build around maybe. But the reason I wasn't that high on it is because we've seen similar cards that don't check for creature type at all. Like, they don't care about creature type. And they're still, like, okay. Like, you know, there's some formats where they're better. There's some versions of this effect that are better, like Blood Artist counts all creatures, right? That is a huge difference from what this is. It doesn't just count your creatures, counts your opponents. You know, things like that are different, even though they're kind of the same. But then you have Rakish Crew really specifically only asking for one creature type, and it only counts yours. And it's just not good enough, and we've seen that on similar cards. And the last card I want to look at is Sheriff of Safe Passage. It is picked around pick 7.4, and it has a win rate of 52.6%. This is another one where I was pretty much right in the set review. I think I gave it a C-. It's probably a little worse than that. The reason I didn't like it in the set review, and it's pretty much stood up to, obviously, how the format has panned out, is that it is real bad on its own. I've said that a few times in this video, right? And that's always a problem in Limited. Even in a grindier format like this one, you still need cards that have a good baseline most of the time, or an incredibly high ceiling. And this kind of doesn't have either. The baseline of the card is 3 mana 1/1, or I guess if you plot it on 2 and then play it on 3, 2 mana 1/1. Woo! But, you know, it has upside for sure. Like, you know, you can plot it early, play it out on a board that has a bunch of creatures on it. That's kind of the dream, right? Guess what? Then the absolute ceiling on this card is that it's a big vanilla creature. That doesn't do any, you know, doesn't deliver any kind of value other than sheer size, right? This format has Death Touchers in it that cost a lot less, that can just trade with this. This format has lots of good removal that can easily kill Sheriff of Safe Passage. You know, in this day and age, you either need a card to be pretty good on its own or to be able to deliver serious value when you set something up, and it doesn't do either. So it's been a really underwhelming card, and generally isn't one that should be making the cut in your white decks. Alright, so those are my picks for 10 cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction that you should probably stop playing, or at the very least, stop taking so highly. Next week, we'll look at the opposite. We'll be a little more positive. We'll look at the cards that are better than where people are taking them right now in this limited format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos in this series, more about Thunder Junction Limited, including Thunder Junction draft videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.